Let's add a crafting block entity to our Minecraft mod. Even more topics available in the 121 Minecraft modding courses, now with energy and fluid handling for block entities next to many other awesome topics. Alright, we found back to tutorial once more, and in this tutorial we'll be adding a crafting block entity to our Minecraft mod, which is going to be akin to, let's say, a furnace. Now, it's not going to be exactly like a furnace. We're only going to have one input slot, for example. However, the idea still remains the same. It's going to be a similar type block entity to our pedestal. However, this time, when we open the inventory, we can put in an item and it's going to craft another item out of it. In this tutorial, we're actually going to make this sort of hard-coded so that we are only going to be able to put in one item and we're going to get one specific item out of it. But then in the next tutorial, we're also going to have a recipe type. It's going to be pretty freaking cool. Now, at the length of this specific tutorial, you'll see that this is an involved process. There's a couple of things to note, basically. Number one, we will be copying over quite a few things. So I highly recommend you go down into the description below, into the GitHub repository, and check out the code, because there's a lot of things to do. We have a custom block class, a custom block entity class. We have the screen and the screen handler classes that we're going to do. So there's quite a few things to do, and all of those are not short classes. But regardless of this, even when we copy stuff over, I hopefully can explain everything well enough for you to understand everything. And we will start with the custom block class. So this is going to be under block custom. And here we're going to create the growth chamber block in this case. There we go. And this will extend from the block with entity class, and it will implement the block entity provider interface. We'll hover over this to implement the two methods we need. We're going to hover over this again, create constructor matching super, which we're going to make public in this case, and then we can proceed. The first thing we need is the codec. Now, this we've previously seen already. This is simply a map codec of whatever block we're trying to create, and we're using the same class create codec over here and just passing in the constructor of it. And then we can simply return this codec in the getCodec method. Very straightforward. Then we get the create block entity method, where we have to create a deliberate error because our block entity doesn't exist yet, so that we don't forget to actually add this. And also, for every block with entity type, right, a block in this case, we have to override the get render type method, extremely important, where we of course return the block render type of model. Otherwise, our block is going to be invisible, which usually is not something that we'd like. And then we get to copy over two different methods, actually three different methods. We're going to just do all three of them, and I'll explain from top to bottom. Now, don't worry at all. This is going to be the onStateReplace method, the onUseWithItem method, and the getTicker method. And we will get some errors, but that is totally normal because, of course, right now, our growth chamber block entity, that doesn't exist yet. So obviously, it's not going to be there. That's why we're going to have some errors, but those will be fixed in due time. To quickly catch you up on what all of these things do, the first one here gets called when this block gets destroyed. And when that happens, I basically want the block entity to drop its contents. And that's what happens here. That's literally all that this does. The onUseWithItem method, well, as you can see, named screen handler factory, and then here player open handled screen. So in this case, this is the opening of the screen method, so to speak. So that is also quite important. And finally, the getTicker method over here is quite interesting because this one basically allows the tick method over here to be called. Now we're going to actually change this up a little bit. When you copy this over, this will already be done with for you. So that's going to be okay. We're going to simply do the following. We're going to say if the world is a client, then we're going to return null. The reason for this is because we want the tick method to only happen on the server. It doesn't need to be on the client, so that's fine. And the idea is as follows. The tick method that we will have right here is actually really freaking cool. And it's going to be called once per tick. That's why it's called the tick method. And this basically means that it gets called 20 times a second. And this is where all of our logic of our custom crafting block entity is going to take place. It's going to be really freaking huge, I'm telling you. But regardless, right now, this is the block class as much as we can finish it. We're going to come back when the block entity, has been registered and all of that, and then we can finish this. But first of all, we're going to register the block. And this is as easy as, of course, in our mod blocks class, we're going to have the growth underscore chamber right here. And this is going to be the growth underscore chamber here as well, which is, of course, a new growth chamber block. And we don't even need the non-opaque in this case. It's going to be fine. And while we're at it, let's immediately add it to the item group, because that can be a thing that I tend to forget. And then we have this done as well, and the registration is done, and we can actually create the block entity class, which will be quite the endeavor. So in the block entity custom package, we're going to right click new Java class, call the growth chamber block entity. There we go. And this will extend the block entity class. It will also implement the extended screen handler factory of type block pause, and then comma implemented inventory. So it's also going to implement the inventory here as well. Let's hover over this to implement all of the methods over here. Hover over again, create constructor matching super, and then we get to start. First of all, in the constructor, of course, we're going to remove the type parameter. And here we will keep the error for the time being, as we basically need to register our block entity. Actually, let's just register it, because why not? We can already do that. So we're going to go to the mod block entities class, and we will simply actually register it. In this case, I'm going to copy this over. I'm going to duplicate this. Always be wary when you duplicate something like the registration or anything like that, that you change every single thing. So block entity type, pedestal block entity changes to a growth chamber block entity. The name changes to growth _ chamber _ BE. Awesome. And then we have a name. This is going to be the growth _ chamber _ BE. And finally here we have the growth chamber block entity. And this is where a lot of people will make a mistake. We have the mod blocks pedestal, which we have to change to growth chamber. This is why, and listen, this has happened to me numerous times, so I'm speaking very much out of experience. When you duplicate something or copy something over and you have a different name, double check each individual thing. It is super easy to brush past it. Oh yeah, this is fine. It's not fine. Always double check everything over here. But that is the growth chamber block entity registered. And we can actually finish off the growth chamber block with this. If we simply import the mod block entities class, we import the growth chamber block entity, then everything here is done. The onState replace method now works. The onUse with item method works. And here in the create block entity, we can simply make a new growth chamber block entity, passing in the position and the state. That's going to be fine. And then at the very bottom over here, we do need to create this tick method, and we will do so inside of the growth chamber block entity. And we're going to deal with this in a second. Here, I just wanted to rename this to world and state, because that's a little bit nicer. But we're gonna deal with the tick method in a little bit. That's going to be where all of our logic goes. But first of all, here in the super call mod block entities.growth chamber BE, and all of a sudden, there's no more errors. So can we just jump into the game? Of course we can't. There's so many things not added yet. For example, the growth chamber block entity will have an inventory. And this inventory, of course, is going to look kind of like this. We've seen this previously, a default list of item stack. This is going to be our inventory with a size of 2 this time, because we're going to have an input slot as well as an output slot. And that's going to be the idea here. So that's why it is 2 in this case. And for this, we will have some, additional things. So the additional thing here is going to be 2 private static final integers. Those are going to be 0 and 1. This is just for ease of access for the inventory, because if we wanted to, get anything from the inventory, we would say inventory.get. And if I put in a 0 over here, sure, that's fine. Right now, we know that this is the input slot. But, if we look at this again in 3 months, then you're like, what the heck is 0? What the heck is 1? Especially now we only have 1 input slot. What if you had like 8 different input slots? It would get very complicated very fast. That is why this is a super cool idea. Next thing is 3 more fields we'll copy over. This is going to be the property delegate, the integer progress, as well as the max progress. The property delegate allows us to synchronize some values from the server to the client and the client to the server. That is going to be super important because, of course, our progress over here. Now, the progress is going to be the progress while crafting. When I put something into my input slot, what I want to have happen is some progress ticks up until we are done. In this case, we're going to, increment the progress variable by 1 tick every tick if we have a proper item in there. And once it reaches the max progress, right, once it has 72 ticks done, then what we're going to do is we're going to say, all right, now we're going to craft this item. That's the idea in this case. And this, of course, all needs to be synced from client to server via this property delegate. And that's going to look kind of like this. I'll copy over the assignment of this. It looks a little bit strange, but don't worry, I'll explain. So the idea here is that the property delegate is equal to a new property delegate. And then this is an anonymous class. We can see we overwrite the get method, the set method, and the size method. In the size method, we return 2, because in this case, we want to synchronize both the progress as well as the max progress variables. So that is why we need this. And that's sort of the idea. And this is basically everything that there's to it. We're going to see the property delegate in a little bit in the menu again, but for the time being, that is all we need. In the get screen opening data, this dot pause, very straightforward. Get items, this dot inventory or just inventory. Get display name is going to be text.translatable, which we're going to do block.tutorialmod.growth_chamber, because this is going to be the same translation as the block name. And why not just use that? That's going to be totally fine. In the create menu method, well, here we need to create once again, a deliberate error because, well, we don't have the menu yet, or rather the screen handler, so we can't do anything with this yet. But of course, we're not done quite just yet. Next thing to add are 2 methods that I usually add to the very bottom. This is going to be, once again, the toUpdatePacket method, as well as the toInitialize chunk data NBT method, which of course call the specific create NBT method over here, as well as here, create the block entity update S2C packet in this case. Now, those 2 are needed, once again, for synchronization of server and client. And that's basically the highest level overview that you really need to know for this in this case. And finally, there's 2 more methods that we of course need, and that is reading and writing NBT data. And that happens with the, well, exactly the write NBT and the read NBT methods. Now, both of those we've seen previously in the pedestal block entity 2, where we've written the inventory literally like this: inventories, write NBT, NBT inventory, registry lookup. And here we read the NBT as well. And then that's basically the idea. Now here is a difference though, because we also save the progress as well as the max progress here in this case, because those 2 should also be saved, right? When I'm mid progress of the block entity crafting, then and I, leave the game, I obviously, when I come back, the progress should resume, right? I think that that's actually a fair point. And right now, the max progress is 72. Let's say you change the max progress to like 800 or whatever you want, like a huge number, right? Or maybe you want to change it depending on the recipe, because in theory, you could also do that. Then obviously, aborting the progress here would be kind of a stupid thing to do. And in terms of the general shape of this class, these are all of the sort of methods that we desperately need, so to speak, for this to function. And now we get to the tick method, which is the first method that is going to be requiring some of your creative capabilities, let's say. And when I say creative capabilities, what I mean by that is we're now no longer in a template mode, okay? When I say, let's say, for example, when I told you, oh, this is how we add the crop block, right? You can do a max age of this, or this is all sort of template mode, right? You have to add this method and you have to return this, and you can change some variables over here, but you're not really crazily programming, right? Here, now you're programming, okay? So this is also the moment. I've said this multiple times in previous tutorials as well, and I will keep saying this. Now is the time where your Java knowledge is basically asked, right? And if you have none, highly recommended to get some more. That is, this can only help you in your modding journey. I can tell you this. Regardless of this, though, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the logic over here. So I'm going to write some code. We're going to call methods that don't exist yet, because they're going to have names that probably are sort of understandable, and then we'll implement them afterwards. So I'm going to first of all go through all of the logic in the tick method, and then we're going to add those methods, like the actual implementation of them. This is one paradigm of programming that you can use. You don't have to, right? In theory, you can also, write the methods individually and then add them later. That's totally fine. But I think that this is hopefully going to illustrate sort of the way that this is going to work. You remember, once again, the tick method is called once every tick, which means basically 20 times a second, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to first of all look if we even have a recipe, right? When I say we're going to ask a question, I'm asking sort of a Boolean, right? I'm looking for a Boolean. So if I say if has recipe, right? I'm asking the question, quote unquote, do we have a recipe? And that obviously needs a Boolean answer, right? Now, if we do have a recipe, we want to do something. And if we do not have a recipe, we also want to do something. We're going to make this an if-else statement. And this if-else statement is going to basically compose the entire tick method. In the else statement, we're going to call the reset progress method, which once again, it doesn't exist yet, but that's not an issue. We're going to implement this as we go along, or after we've basically gone through the logic. Now, if we do have a recipe, what is it that we want to do? Well, of course, in this case, we want to increase the crafting progress, right? Because we want to continue to craft over here because we have a recipe available. We also need to call the mark dirty method with the world, block pause, and state over here. That is quite important because that will once again do some synchronization stuff for us. And finally, well, we're increasing the crafting progress over here. And at some point, well, aren't we finished at some point? Yes. If has crafting finished is then the next question we're asking. And once that is the case, what do we do then? Well, how about we craft the item? I mean, that's as simple as that. And of course, we also want to reset the progress again because we want to start at the beginning and not just keep crafting items until we're done and we don't have any anymore. We actually want to reset the progress every time we've crafted the item. And that is, in this essence, the entirety of the logic here. Now, of course, as we go into these methods, we will find that there's a little bit more logic that we actually need to add, but that's totally fine. So we're going to start, of course, with the has recipe method. We will simply hover over this, create method in growth chamber block entity, and then it will create this for us. You can see even smart enough to know that this is a Boolean method because it's just absolutely awesome. Now, what does it mean to have a recipe? Well, in our case, we're going to just hardcode this, meaning we're going to say, okay, we have a certain item input, right? So this is going to be an item over here, which is going to be an input. And this is going to be, let's say, mod items.raw pink garnet, right? So our input is always going to be raw pink garnet. If there's anything else inside of our block entity, it's not going to craft anything. Okay. And then the question is, what is going to be our output? Our output is actually immediately going to be an item stack. It's going to be a little bit easier. And we're going to make a new item stack of mod items.pink garnet. And let's say we're going to get 6 pink garnets out of it. Because why the frick not, right? 6 pink garnets. So I put 1 raw pink garnet inside of my input slot, and I will get out after, whatever happens over here when the craft item method at some point gets called, I will get out 6 pink garnets. Okay, that is pretty cool already. But how can we sort of turn this into a Boolean? How can we do that? Well, we can say this.getStack, right? In slot, input slot. So this would get us whatever item stack is inside of the input slot, and we can say is of input, meaning is of the desired input, which is the raw pink garnet. So if we have a raw pink garnet in our input slot, all of a sudden, now we have a recipe. That is pretty cool. However, now we have to think one step further. We also have an output slot. And while, yes, of course, right now, the pink garnet is the only thing that we can insert into it, there also might be other things that we could insert into it. So that would be a little more complicated now, because we would have to first of all check, wait a second, can we actually even insert into our output slot? And not only is it depending on what the type of item is, but also how many. So we ask 2 more questions. Can insert amount into output slot? Because with actually the output.getCount. And then also we're asking a second one, and that is going to be can insert item into output slot? Because we also need to think about, well, wait a second, if the item that we want to put into the output slot is different than the one that is already in there, well, I can't just overwrite that item. That wouldn't work. So that's why we do both of these things as well. Let's hover over the first method and the second method over here. So just create both of those, and then let's see their logic. I will copy over the contents of this, but I will explain. The can insert item into output slot, which is this one right here, looks like this. If the slot is empty, obviously we can simply insert it. I think this should make total sense, and this shouldn't be anything crazy. Now, let me basically use the OR operator to say, well, this can be true or this can be true, and then the entire statement will be true. And the second thing here is that if the output slot has the same item that we want to produce, right? This output slot already has pink garnet in there, then of course this is also true, and therefore this particular method returns a true. On the count, we have just a little bit of a crazier thing. Now, it's not too insane actually, because we actually need to check a couple of things. The first thing we need to check the max count in total, like how many items can this sort of slot even hold? If there's nothing in there, then usually this should be 64, and we can get the current count, which in this case, in the case of it being empty is actually 0, and then this should be totally fine. However, so for example, There might be signs, right? If the output is a sign, then obviously that is a different max count. That's why I basically get this max count. The idea here is simply the following. Because we're getting 6 items out of every raw pink garnet, at some point, right, we might, let's say, be at 63 raw pink garnets in there, and this has to be bigger or equal to the current count. Sorry, actually, this is... so the maximum count is going to be 64. However, currently we might have 63 items inside of our output slot, and we want to add 6 of them. Well, that is not going to work, because 64 is not bigger or equal to, in this case, 69. Nice. So that is why this wouldn't work, right? We would not be able to craft anything if the count over here is too big for it to insert. Hopefully, I talked around this a little bit, but hopefully that is vaguely understandable. I think the logic here hopefully is understandable. I know that there's a lot of steps to follow, but in this case, that is what we need for the has recipe method. Luckily, this is probably the most complicated thing, and then it is easy breezy from here. Increasing the crafting progress, we're going to hover over this, and what do we need to do here? Well, it is as easy as saying this.progress ++, and that is it, because we're simply going to increase or increment the progress variable, 1 tick per tick, as long as we have a recipe, and then at some point, right, it's going to reach a threshold, and this threshold is has crafting finished. Here, we're going to return this.progress is bigger or equal to this.max progress. Basically saying, hey, if we've reached the max progress over here, then we know we are done and we can then craft the item. Let's hover over this to create the craft item method. And let's also hover over the reset progress method, because I actually wanted to do the reset progress method first, because this one, super freaking simple. This progress is equal to 0 and this max progress is equal to 72 in this case. I simply want to reset it to this in this case. Now, the reason I also reset max progress is just in case if we ever do want to change it, or let's say if we ever do want to adjust it based on a recipe, let's say, for example, then we can very easily do it here as well. Now, crafting the item. What do we need to do? Well, first of all, we need to remove one of the items from the input slot, right? So this remove stack in the slot input slot, and we're going to take one of them, right? So we're simply going to take one item out of the input slot. And then what is going to be our output? Well, let's actually just do this. So we're going to say, well, let's actually make an item stack over here, which is going to be our output. And that is, of course, going to be 6 pink garnets. So let's actually just copy this over. That's going to be fine. And then what we can do is we can say this.set stack output slot, and we're going to make a new item stack here. This is trick of the trade. So we're going to say a new item stack of output.getItem, but the count here is going to be this.getStack in output slot.getCount plus whatever the output.getCount is, so that it basically adds 6 each time over here in this case. And that's going to be absolutely fantastic. And that is the logic of the block entity done. Hopefully I explained this well enough for you to have understood it. I highly recommend what you do is you take this, and once we add the screen and the screen handler and everything works over here, you take this, you make it work once, and then you go from there and just play around with this a little bit, right? Shift this around, see what happens if you remove the reset progress methods and things like that. Just be open to experimentation. The greatest thing here is you can't break anything if you simply do a Control-Z or Control-Z. And also, if you use GitHub, let's say, for example, and you just save everything when it works, and then you can always revert back later. That is one of the greatest things that we have here as programmers in this case. You can break something, but in theory, hopefully, if you've taken enough precautions beforehand, you can always revert back. All right, that is pretty awesome. But now we get to the screens, or rather the screen and the screen handler. So in the screen custom package, we're going to make a new Java class called the growth chamber screen handler, not scheme handler. What the heck? There we go. And we'll also make the growth chamber screen class. There we friggin' go. And then let's start with the screen handler. Here, once again, I will be copying over quite a few things, but I will try to explain best I can. This will extend from the screen handler class, where we will implement the 2 methods, and then we will start copying over. The first thing we need is both the constructor, the top constructor, as well as the 3 fields. So this is going to be, as you can see, the inventory, the property delegate, as well as the growth chamber block entity. And inside of the first constructor, we're calling this. So we're calling a secondary constructor, passing the sync ID, the inventory, the block position at a particular position, as well as a new array property delegate. And then we get the secondary constructor, which looks like this. I'm just going to once again copy that over. It has a sync ID, the player inventory, the block entity, and the array property delegate, thus having no more errors in the first constructor. And here we're going to call a super with the first parameter not being available just yet, and the second parameter being the sync ID. The first parameter here is, of course, the registered screen handler, which we'll have in a second. We will then continue by saying this.inventory is equal to the block entity .cast, and we're going to cast this to an inventory. Then we're going to say this.block entity is equal to the block entity parameter .cast, once again, this time though to a growth chamber block entity. And finally, this.property delegate is equal to the array property delegate here in the as a parameter. That is also awesome. And there we go. Then we need to add 2 slots. It's going to be our input and output slot. This.add slot is going to be a new slot, passing in the inventory, passing in 0, passing in 54 and 34. These are, of course, the coordinates of our slots in this case. And the second one is going to be a new slot, once again, of inventory, this time index 1, and here of 104 as a X. We're going to need a couple of methods. First of all, we're going to copy over the add player hotbar method, add player inventory method, and I'll also copy over the contents of the can use method. Now, all of those should be pretty much exactly the same as in the pedestal screen handler. At the very least, both the add player and add player hotbar methods are exactly the same, and those will also then be called after the slots right here. There we go. And finally, this is super important. We want to add the add properties method, passing in the array property delegate over here. Super important. When it comes to the quick move method, this one, of course, too, we'll copy over because this is always going to be the same, responsible for shift clicking into and out of the custom inventory, and that just deals with all of the different calculations in this case. And finally, we have 2 more methods that we're going to need. These are quite important. Now I'll copy those over and we'll see. You see, the first one here is the isCrafting method, and you will find I'm going to take the property delegate 0 over here, and we say this is bigger than 0, then we're crafting. What the frick does this mean? Well, if you remember, like about, I don't even know, 20 minutes back or so, when I told you, hey, we're going to take a look at the property delegate in a little bit, well, a little bit has just arrived. And the idea is that obviously the property delegate, what does it have? Well, wait a second, it has the progress in 0, meaning that here, if the progress is bigger than 0, then we are crafting. And of course, this is absolutely true, because when we're crafting, then we're increasing the progress. So there you go. And you can actually see the same thing right here in the scale progress, where we have the progress, max progress, as well as the arrow pixel size. The arrow is going to be whatever is displayed as the progress arrow, and that one is 24 pixels. And what this does is basically give you the amount of pixels, but depending on how far along the progress we are. That's basically what this crazy thing over here does, so that it doesn't divide by 0, let's say. So the idea is that if we're 50% done with the progress, then we're going to show 12 pixels of the arrow. That's all that there's to it, basically. That is actually, apart from the super call over here, the entire screen handler class done. So let's actually register this in the mod screen handlers over here. Once again, we're just going to copy this over, duplicate this. But if you duplicate, always double check. This is very important. Pedestal screen handler will be a growth chamber screen handler. Of course, changing the name over here too to the growth _chamber _screen _handler. Then we have a different name over here at path is going to be the growth _chamber _screen _handler. Then we have this one over here. This is the growth screen handler, please, not the screen. And now no errors should be present. We can call this in the screen handler right here. This is going to be mod screen handlers dot growth chamber screen handler, and the class is done as per usual. And I hope that you've been following along with the GitHub repository. Otherwise, this would be very strange and not as straightforward. But still, the code is of course all available there. And finally, the screen, which is the last bastion, so to speak. And you will find this is also not too bad. This extends from the handled screen of type growth chamber screen handler. We'll hover over this to implement the draw background method. We'll hover over this again, create constructor matching super. And here we're going to need 2 identifiers. Once again, I'll copy those over, but you will see they are very, very straightforward. So these 2 are simply as follows. They simply are the GUI texture and the arrow texture. Now the GUI texture is going to be under textures, GUI growth chamber GUI PNG. Let's add this. That's going to be under tutorial mod texture GUI, and we need a new directory called growth_chamber, making sure we write this correctly as well. And that's going to be the growth chamber GUI. I will have this, of course, available to you for download, and it looks kind of like this. So we can see this is our input slot. Then we're going to, put whatever item we have in there. In this case, obviously, it's going to be a raw pink garnet, and that is then going to have this arrow slowly move over here until finally it reaches the end, and we're going to get a pink garnet, or actually like 6 pink garnets out of that. Absolutely fantastic. Now, we also, of course, need the arrow progress because, well, this is just the gray arrow, and the arrow progress we'll also have, this is going to be under the GUI though. This is textures GUI arrow progress, and there we go. And then we have a couple of things. The first thing is the render method that simply draws the mouse over text tooltip, just so that we have the names of the methods, the names of the items again, and things like that. And then the contents of the draw background method, except for the last line, is going to be the following. Of course, the 3 set of lines that we've seen previously, then the X and the Y coordinates, and then here we're drawing the GUI texture at X and Y, 0, 0 with the background width and height. And then we have the render progress arrow method, which looks like this. So you can see that if the handler is crafting, right? So if crafting is here our custom method in our custom screen handler. If this is true, then we're drawing the arrow texture at position 7335, and we are drawing of it a scaled arrow progress in width, and the height of 16 pixels will always be drawn. The entire PNG is 24 by 16. You can actually double check this. As you can see, 24 by 16, and that is the idea. So depending on how much of the scaled arrow progress we have, that is how much width of this particular texture will be drawn. That is how that works, and it will be drawn at 7335. And if we were to look over here, 73 to the right is around about here, and 35 down is right about here. So it will be drawn above this arrow, exactly where we would like this to be drawn. Absolutely amazing. After the context draw texture, we simply then can call render progress arrow, passing in the context, passing in X, passing in Y, and that is that. That is it, and that is done. And now the code in essence is basically finished. We simply just need the data gen for the model. In this case, that's just, of course, for our block. Oh, that's actually not everything. Wait a second. Block entity class, of course. Want to do this. See, this is why I make the deliberate errors, because otherwise I would have forgotten. Here, we want the growth chamber screen handler, passing in the sync ID, passing in the player inventory, passing in this, and then passing in this dot property delegate. And that's going to finish this. And now all of our things are done. We can close everything, and we can add the model over here. This is simply going to be a simple cube all for our growth chamber. That's as easy as it is. And for that, of course, we need a block texture as well, which will be available to you too. It's going to be the growth chamber PNG over here. There we go. And then a translation. This is actually quite important, but obviously I think quite understandable in this case. Finally, we want to connect everything. So that means in the client class, we want to do handled screens register. So we want to do exactly the same for the growth chamber screen handler. And then here, the growth chamber screen : new. Now, let me just think about this for just a second, because, it is an involved process, so that is very fair. However, I'm pretty sure when we look at this, I think that we should have everything we're going to need. We have the block, we've added it to the item group. We have the screen, we have the screen handler. We have everything we need. Dare I say, I think we've got it. I think this is it. Now, still a very involved process. It's not as easy as one might think. And of course, if you want anything crazier than this, right, more input slots and all of that, that's going to make it more complicated, of course. But whatever the case may be, now that we have this, let's first of all run data gen over here so that it generates the JSON files for our new custom block. And once that is done, well, then let's jump into the game and see if it works. All right, fans, I'm back in Minecraft, and let's just get our growth chamber over here. Let's get a raw pink garnet as well, and let's put it down and let's take a look. So if we open it, you can see there is everything that we have. And if I take a raw pink garnet and put it in here, what will happen? Of course, it's going to start crafting the item. And once the progress arrow is done, 6 pink garnets. And I can, of course, keep it going, right? I can put how many amount of here that I want in there, and it's going to keep going. And that is exactly what we want to have happen. Absolutely freaking fantastic. And that is a custom crafting block entity added to Minecraft. Absolutely awesome, man. If you made it this far, I commend you, because this is not an easy topic to actually do. And yeah, it's just complicated. It just is what it is. There's so many different moving parts to it. Hopefully everything was understandable, and as per usual, you can double check the code in the description below in the GitHub repository. I cannot recommend enough. Get this to work once and then try to expand it from there. This is a good template or groundwork that you can use and work off of, hopefully for any type of machine that you'd want to add on your own. But for the time being, that's going to be it for this tutorial right here. Next time in this video, we'll also add a custom recipe type, allowing us to read in JSON files instead of hard coding everything. Hope to see you there. So, yeah.